they're a chunky insect. And if people haven't seen like giant Wētā before and they were to stumble upon one of these things, they'd probably notice straight away, like, oh shoot, that's a big insect, because they're pretty hefty and quite unusual looking compared to what most people would see. Because these animals are primarily subalpine, alpine adapted species, you can imagine they have a narrow width for their entire distribution and home. And as the climate warms and that snow line starts to go higher and higher and higher and higher, their habitat becomes increasingly sparse and absent. And eventually some of these species will literally have nowhere to go. So climate change is a big threat, and it's not necessarily just about temperature. It's also about how the habitat composition changes. To date, most of the work I've done with lizards through Southern Lakes is survey work. You can't really protect species if you don't know that they're there. People presume that their method of monitoring will give them the information they want, i.e. like a population trend over time, but that's not necessarily always true. Because there's so many factors that interfere with animals like activity, potentially you might not be fully understanding that system if you just use one method. Calibrating these tools is quite important, because potentially you might put a camera out and maybe if you were actually searching all night long, you might find 20 Wētā in an area, whereas the camera might just pick up one.
Hello, kia ora. I'm Anna.
And I'm Caleb from Conservation Amplified.
And you're listening to the People Helping Nature podcast.
Our mission is to make conservation mainstream, one topic at a time.
In the last episode, we spoke with Paul, the CEO of Southern Lake Sanctuary, and now we're here for a round 2 of Southern Lake Sanctuary with Samuel Purdie, herpetologist and lizard and reptile specialist. And we have some really cool stuff in store today, talking about everything wētās, everything lizards, and the amazing work that you guys are doing around the Southern Lakes. Welcome, Sam.
Howdy.
Kia ora.
Would you like to start by introducing yourself and your role at Southern Lake Sanctuary?
So my name's Sam. I love all things critters, and so naturally my work is going to be with all things critters. At Southern Lake Sanctuary, my role's a little bit more broad in that, like, I'm a coordinator of a variety of different projects. Most of those are focused on trying to improve our understanding of native invertebrates and reptiles. Particularly at the moment, a lot of my work is quite monitoring focused, so trying to improve our ability, at least locally, to monitor some of these native species, because monitoring can be quite a complex endeavor. So that's a lot of what my work is at the moment. There's a few other fun things in there, like I'm going to start to do some more predator control oriented work, but because of some of the challenges with lizards, it's not so straightforward, and that's why I haven't been doing too much of that to date. But yeah, a lot of work on trying to improve our ability to monitor, and also just doing general surveys for native reptiles.
That is so cool. So before we dig deep, how did your passion evolve towards lizards and invertebrates?
Good question. I feel like it's kind of always just been there. Like, I'm sure there'll be like little experiences I had when I was a kid that helped mold that passion, but I genuinely don't remember a day where I was ever not turning a log or like hyper focused on some cool beetle or something. So I do kind of think it's just something innate almost. That's not super scientific of me, but definitely feels like it, just because it's ever since I was tiny, I've been fascinated by them.
That makes sense. So a lot of people think of these small critters as something they stay away from, or they go, ooh,
Creepy crawlies.
But they do play a really important role in our ecosystem. So what is the role that invertebrates and lizards play, especially in New Zealand?
In essence, they're crucial to all wildlife as far as I'm concerned. Their specific role in each specific system will vary, but some of the common roles that they fill are like decomposers. So a lot of native invertebrates, they're important in helping recycle nutrients in forests and things. They're breaking down organic material. That's hugely important. They are food for other animals. So many other lives depend on their existence, ultimately including our own. For lizards, it's not so clear cut in New Zealand, but some of the key things that they do is, again, they're food for other animals, but they also probably play quite important pollination and seed dispersal roles, at least on a small scale. Some of that research is still being conducted. It hasn't been explored hugely, but I know some people locally that are exploring that a bit more and have been able to demonstrate that, at least locally and at a small scale, lizards can be quite important seed dispersers.
Thank you for sharing that with our audience and setting the stage of why they're important and why we decided to talk about them being, I guess, sounds always horrible when you say it, but the bottom of the food chain.
The foundation, right?
The foundation of the food chain, the circle of life. So for the work that Southern Sanctuary does with Alpine Wētā, can you talk us through the projects that are currently going on?
Yeah, so at the moment, we're primarily interested in improving our ability to monitor them. So we can go out and we can count wētā, we can go out and we can put tracking tunnels out, but unless you've fully calibrated these tools, it's difficult to know how powerful they are. And so this often happens in conservation where people presume that their method of monitoring will give them the information they want, i.e. like a population trend over time, but that's not necessarily always true. Because there's so many factors that interfere with animals like activity, potentially you might not be fully understanding that system if you just use one method. So for example, tracking tunnels, you can put them out, but they're primarily an activity measure. They won't actually tell you how many wētā are in a system necessarily, because maybe the conditions were just really nice when you put your tunnels out, and so there were heaps of wētā. Or maybe if you haven't spaced them adequately, one wētā walked through all of your tunnels, giving you quite a false understanding of how many are around. So what we're trying to do at the moment is calibrate those tools to see what works well, and also from like a cost-effective lens, because we want it to be like practical, because sometimes the best solution in terms of data and understanding isn't necessarily the most practical solution. So we're going to be running several different search strategies and monitoring strategies simultaneously so that we can meaningfully compare them. And some of them aren't like apples to apples. You have to do some kind of funky data analyses to actually compare them because they're slightly different. So for example, tracking tunnels, because it's quite different to like a mark-recapture study, say, they're not super easy to compare, but you can run what's called like a regression and see if they correlate with one another roughly. And if they kind of look like they more or less correlate with one another over time, then probably a pretty useful strategy.
Yeah, right. And so this is for a specific species of wētā, right? It's not multiple different types.
So we're pretty fortunate in our area that we have at least one population of Southern Alps giant wētā. This is a gorgeous, gorgeous native insect that was once still relatively widespread in the South Island actually, but they've disappeared from so many areas. So they were formerly quite abundant, even in our region. So they were quite abundant. George Gibbs in the early 90s, he could find many dozens of individuals just in a couple of hours searching. But in some of these places, they are extremely rare or possibly locally extirpated.
Do they have an official conservation status? Like, do we have an estimated of population from there and now? Or, yeah, what's going on?
The current conservation status is nationally endangered. For a while, they were considered not threatened, partly because of that work by George Gibbs. It's like, oh, sweet, there's heaps of them, all good. And then we kind of just forget about them for a couple of decades. And then when people actually start to revisit those sites and look for them, it's like, oh, shoot, these things are actually quite rare and not present at some of these locations where they were previously. So they're nationally endangered. The current criteria they've been ranked by would suggest that there's less than or equal to 15 subpopulations, the largest of which probably only numbers 500 individuals. But I think that will need updating shortly.
And how big are they? Like, do we know much about them? And do they have any special adaptations to help them survive? Because being in the alpine environment is pretty harsh, right?
Yeah, I'm astonished at the locations these insects live in, to the point where we've had to stop working in some of them because it's like underneath a cliff that gets 4 hours sunlight a day. And there's like every time you'll go to the site, there'd be like a new car-sized piece of ice just sitting there, and you're like, oh yeah, we probably shouldn't work here anymore. It's just a bit hazardous. But the wētā are actually, that's where they managed to survive. So it's a chunky insect, about the size of a mouse, so about 65 millimeters long. So, you know, a hefty insect. It's certainly not our largest species of giant wētā. That would be the little barrier giant wētā, or Wētā punga, Deinacrida heteracantha, and those are titanic. They are often regarded as one of the largest insects in the world.
So how big do they get just by comparison to the Southern Alps giant wētā?
They can grow to be about 90, 100 millimeters long, so very chunky insects.
But that's still big for a Southern Alps wētā at 65 mils. You know, that's still, what, 2/3 the size of our largest wētā?
Yeah, they're a chunky insect. And if people haven't seen like giant wētā before and they were to stumble upon one of these things, they'd probably notice straight away, like, oh shoot, that's a big insect, because they're pretty hefty and quite unusual looking compared to what most people would see.
What about special adaptations? Do we know anything about that makes them thrive in that alpine environment?
So in this species specifically, to the best of my knowledge, it's never been studied. We can probably make some inferences about it by looking at other related species. So, for example, the mountain stone wētā, whose physiology has been studied quite extensively. And they certainly do have some interesting adaptations which help them persist in alpine environments. So one of which is called an isonucleating protein, or proteins plural. And what they do is they basically speed up the formation of ice crystals, right? And they try to restrict the formation of ice crystals so that it's outside of their cells. So you can imagine if you're an insect and you have ice crystals in your body, bad. You don't want those in your body. They're going to tear everything apart. So what they kind of do with these isonucleating proteins is they osmotically dehydrate their cells, and they try to concentrate. When I say they try, this is like a physiological process. The wētā isn't like, saying I'm going to put it's a physiological process that's kind of just happens. But if we think about it's something that the wētā is doing just for explanatory sake, it'll focus those ice crystals outside the cells to minimize the damage caused, and it'll do so at a higher temperature than crystals would normally form. And this typically means they're less damaging. So some other insects around the world have isonucleating proteins, but this is one adaptation they have which helps them survive freezing. And so they can freeze basically, and it's not like they just turn into a block of ice. They manage to sort of like mitigate the formation of ice crystals in a way that means they can survive.
So possibly silly question, but while they're in that state, is it like hibernation if you compare it to mammals, or?
Yeah, I suppose somewhat. So they will go into a state of like what's called torpor, but yeah, it's an increased state of torpor really. It's not like hibernation where a bear or something will get ready for the winter and eat lots of fat and fall asleep and you prod it and it doesn't move. I don't study bears, so if that's a common misconception, then forgive me. But yeah, if you were to thaw it out, the insect would pretty quickly become alert and it'd be a bit stumbly.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's fascinating.
So taking a look at the human side, what you're doing, how do you monitor and protect such a relatively small species in a massive landscape? And like, where was your starting point? Where did you begin, and are you still doing the same methods, or has that changed over time?
We initially started on one side of the gorge. We started with doing some surveys just to improve our understanding of their local distribution. And that's sort of useful for two things. One, it just tells us where all they live in a given area, but it's also really helpful for identifying sites where we can study them. When you are looking for a study site, you kind of want to have like ideally gentle terrain, nice camp spot, accessible. Things like this will come into play. So initially we were going to monitor them at the place we initially discovered them, which was on underneath these cliffs. But we realized that, no, it's actually a bit unsafe here. We can't work here long term. So then we needed to go and do another survey because there were some places up higher in a similar area where I thought there would be wētā and I'd found them nearby, but I needed to see how abundant they were there. And to do that, you really need to walk around at night and see them and just get a feel for the terrain and think about where you can be putting monitoring devices and things like that. So we hiked in again and we did some night surveying, and then sure enough, there were lots of wētā, which is awesome. And it's certainly inconvenient terrain. It's very precipitous and steep. And last field season, we tried to run our monitoring session and we had to leave because a colleague's tent fell apart and my tent started filling with water.
No.
In addition to that, there were so many wētā, which is amazing, but it meant that it was really slow going. And so my initial study design wasn't really going to work. So I need to revisit the drawing board anyway. There's just so many wētā in these places where there seems to be few predators, which is kind of cool. It means we can get lots of data, and it means we sort of have a good understanding of what wētā abundance looks like when there's few predators around.
I have to take my hat off to you alpine conservation folk. Like, you hear the stories and you think, yeah, okay, they've got the data, but I'm struggling to put myself in your shoes doing this. A few episodes back, we spoke with Lydia at the Kia Conservation Trust, and her, what would you call it, like crawls up hills and running through alpine areas for days on end to find a Kia. And I thought that is crazy, but like this is the same, if not next level. It's like to find places where the predators haven't made it, you've got to get there. And I think that's sometimes underestimated.
Alpine work can be challenging, certainly at a landscape scale. Obviously, Lydia and her colleagues, they'll be crawling into Kia burrows. It's full on. But also, I think that the most difficult addition to alpine work is night work in the alpine, And I've done quite a bit of that, but it just makes things so logistically challenging. And that last field trip we did was really actually helpful for me and informative for that, just in terms of like operating a field team and everything, because you need to manage fatigue. You need to think about what time you're leaving to go onto the field and how long days people are working and how long people are able to stay up for at night. And someone like myself who like very excited about Wētā, love Wētā, want to learn about them, it's slightly easier for me to spend an entire night searching for Wētā so we can get good data and understand them. But for someone who actually probably just wants to be in bed in their tent and would rather not, it is quite a challenging thing, particularly when it's cold. You've got your puffer on, you've got your raincoat on, you're working in steep terrain. Just like logistically and from a health and safety angle, it's definitely a lot more challenging.
Yeah, that's right. And you got to keep yourself safe because you obviously want to keep on doing that mahi for the long term. I'm just curious with methodology and technologies, is there anything on the horizon on the tech front that might make that logistic easier for you?
I certainly hope so. I think with a lot of the like remote sensing technology that's emerging, I'm hopeful that at some stage it will be. The dream would be to have a whole bunch of like an array of monitoring devices in the field that can reliably detect Wētā, and then I can just have that downloaded to a spreadsheet and I can pull up my cell phone and look, and I think that would be awesome. And I think that's definitely where technology is heading. But again, this is why calibrating these tools is quite important, because potentially you might put a camera out and maybe if you were actually searching all night long, you might find 20 Wētā in an area, whereas the camera might just pick up one possibly. So these things need to be considered, but I think so.
And I also guess it's the variety of tools, right? Like presence, absence, that's the easy part. But then knowing more than that, that's usually where it starts getting tricky.
Particularly with technology, it's expensive. And so like someone can walk a transect and they might be able to count, we'll say 20 Wētā on the transect, but maybe the cost of sending someone along their transect is probably similar to like the price of a camera if it's good enough to detect the Wētā and to differentiate between species and things like that. So that's where these sorts of dilemmas come into play too. Like the cost of new technology is obviously quite expensive, but as it advances, more those costs will come down, hopefully.
Yeah, and I can't help but think, like, no matter what we do, we're never going to look at every single individual in a landscape and understand every element of their life. Is it challenging that if you go from you personally looking to your team looking to a camera looking to a different type of technology looking, like you're going to gather different data and it's going to tell a different story? And especially if that's over time, it might paint pictures that, you know, you're never getting the entire reality, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's often inconsistencies. And that's just a general challenge with conservation in New Zealand, because everyone does conservation in quite a different way. Some people, they're super scientific about it, and so it means they've got to have randomization, replication, and it means that sometimes it's just challenging. It's just so hard to do. And some people are just like, no, I don't want to do that. And sometimes when you approach it from like that scientific angle, it also just is impractical, because you can't necessarily expect everyone to run programs of that scale. Because of that, you have lots of inconsistencies between people's data sets. And so it's hard to know what true trends are because everyone measures things in such different ways. But I'm hopeful that by running things simultaneously, it will help us understand a little bit. And then we'll be able to like hopefully plug that into more of like a landscape or national strategy, at least in the South Island. That's my hope, because I definitely think cohesion and conservation is so important. But what works for one person won't necessarily work for someone else.
Yeah. I like the term cohesion. That says a lot. But what about the threats? Like, what are the biggest threats that Southern Alps giant Wētā face?
There's two huge threats that these Wētā face, and that all giant Wētā in the South Island, indeed all alpine dwelling species really face. Exotic mammalian predators, and that's the full suite of mammalian predators. It's not just stoats, it's not just rats, it's stoats, rats, hedgehogs. Lagomorphs, so hares modifying landscape at high elevation, or high numbers of hares at high elevation, meaning that there's more food for stoats. And so because there's more stoats, then there's more predation happening on birds and insects. So mammals are a huge issue, and the threat of mice cannot be understated too, particularly as the climate warms and high elevation habitats become more accessible to mice. I think they're becoming increasingly difficult. So I did a little bit of just a simple exercise where I was looking at tracking tunnel rates from where we've seen these Wētā versus places where they no longer exist. And although I'm working with quite small sample sizes, it's quite obvious that where these Wētā are, there's been no mice detections while there have been tracking tunnels out there. That's not to say they don't live there, but from the data available, mice haven't been recorded there. Or if they're at the lower extent of their elevational distribution, the mice are in low numbers. Whereas you go somewhere like, let's say Homer Tunnel, where these Wētā used to live, and they've been recorded there in the past, but no one's seen them for, decades. And there's been a lot of conservation activity in that area. So if they are there, they'll be restricted to really high and accessible recesses, but lots of mice there, and these Wētā appear to be gone. So I think mice are a huge problem. That won't necessarily be their biggest threat everywhere. So in a system like ours, where maybe there aren't too many mice up super high, but there are stoats might be the biggest predator. And we hope to try to understand these sorts of relationships more once we are confident in our ability to monitor them. So we're going to hope to get into that in subsequent field seasons. And then the other big threat is climate change. So because these animals are primarily subalpine, alpine adapted species, you can imagine they have a narrow width for their entire distribution and home. And as the climate warms and that snow line starts to go higher and higher and higher and higher, their habitat becomes increasingly sparse and absent. And eventually some of these species will literally have nowhere to go. So climate change is a big threat, and it's not necessarily just about temperature. It's also about how the habitat composition changes, how the entire community changes. If you've got a species that's really reliant on like a high rainfall, like lush shrubland type ecosystem, and then all of a sudden it's like experiencing major droughts or becomes a bit of a homogeneous tussock land, that's probably not going to bode so well for them.
And even if the habitat shrunk or the predators got out of control, I mean, they are out of control. If they got worse and we translocated them to, say, a fenced eco-sanctuary or a climate-controlled facility, where do you release them back to if their habitat's not safe?
That's the huge challenge with alpine species, and it's true for invertebrates and lizards at the moment, where conservationists are trying to come up with solutions for these sorts of dilemmas, and invariably they'll end up being quite experimental and quite risky because we just don't have other options. So like with these Wētā, for example, you can't just stick an eco-sanctuary up on top of a mountain. It's just an engineering nightmare. But there's also only maybe like one island I can think of that would possibly have suitable habitat and a suitable elevation to be suitable for these animals. So yeah, it can be very challenging.
Yeah, and I think there's a few species in New Zealand that applies to, where on-site management really is the silver bullet to ensure that they survive into the future. And I just want to touch on the topic of our good old mices. So I feel like mice are totally underestimated quite often, a little bit forgotten about when it comes to predator-free 2050. And they're also super hard to control, small animals, small home ranges. But I want to ask you, with predator-free 2050 becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, we might see an explosion in mice numbers. We're already seeing it in certain areas. What impact does that have on invertebrates in particular?
People often think of mice as like quite small, diminutive animals, not having like a big impact, but a mouse will attack an adult otago skink, which is like a 30 centimeter long lizard. And because mice are driven by resources, so tussock seed or beech seed, when you have masting event, those mouse numbers erupt hugely, and that can have devastating consequences for native wildlife. It also means it's difficult to control them, because unless you're really being crafty with when you implement your predator control, it might not even reduce the mouse numbers at all. Some researchers suggested that there's like this sort of 5% threshold wherein you need to get mice tracking rates below 5% to help lizard and invertebrate populations respond. And I think that is an awesome goal to strive for. It might not necessarily be true for every system, but it certainly seems like a compelling metric to strive for. And so if you can get mice below 5%, then that will hopefully help native wildlife recover. But doing so can be really challenging if you have a resource-rich ecosystem. So James Reardon, scientists from DOC, and Nathan Whitmore, another conservation scientist, they've done some research out on Quail Island, and they've demonstrated that actually keeping mice numbers consistently below 5% is astonishingly challenging.
And I guess the other part that people often don't consider is that when you remove rats and stoats and other invasive predators that eat the mice, that takes the pressure off them, which puts the pressure onto our invertebrates, right?
This is one of the fundamental flaws of the predator-free strategy as it currently stands, and why I vehemently oppose the initial strategy and definitely made submissions about the new one. Because if all you do is take away rats, mustelids, and possums, you're just taking away potential competitors and predators of mice. And so intuitively, their numbers are going to increase. Their behavior is going to change. They're probably going to be more bold, meaning they're probably more likely to attack a lizard, things like that. And so if that strategy was implemented just ubiquitously, they rolled out, let's get rid of all this. Obviously, it's not so straightforward. I don't think they'd approach it like that, but that would have profound consequences for literally these critters that form the base of the ecosystem. You're talking about small insects, invertebrates, large-bodied insects, lizards. And so obviously that's going to have cascading consequences as we move up the ecosystem. And so it's all good and well to think about, the kiwi and the kia, we need to take away the stoats to help them. But how are they going to survive if you take away all of the critters at the bottom of the ecosystems, which are like critical for regulating the entire ecosystem?
Yeah, and I guess like the other side of it, which isn't often considered, is that so many of our native plants have evolved with invertebrate pollinators. And so we look at the Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, and people often think, yeah, that's what pollinates our native species, but it's not. It was the 1800s when that was introduced. So if we lose a lot of these species, then the habitat also disappears. And if you don't have habitat, you don't have the base of the food chain, and you also don't have the waste decomposition, like you mentioned earlier, you have disease proliferation, you have all these issues. How are you expecting the manu, the birds, to survive in that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I definitely think that it's prudent for people to be thinking about whole ecosystems. Obviously, sometimes to tell conservation stories and to help aid particular ecosystems and areas, you want to have some kind of iconic species or some kind of animal that you protect, and it's totally valid and something that we do as well. But beneath that, you want to be thinking about the whole ecosystem as well, and what you're doing might impact other wildlife. Because I think that's realistically what we all want anyway. Deep down, even if we're just focused on a particular species, I think everyone does just want fully functioning indigenous ecosystems, but we're not going to get that if we just think about those flashy animals and what helps them.
Totally. And that's one of the reasons why we're so excited to talk to you today, just to shine a light on these lesser known species, because they are so crucial. And if we don't see it holistically, we can't move forward as an entire conservation sector. So thank you for being open and addressing the mice problem. And do you have any other words of caution for people when they're controlling, in their area, what to be aware of?
Yeah, not specifically. I guess part of the challenge too is we don't necessarily have great standardized tools for this yet. And it's something that I personally struggle with, because people will say, oh, how do I help lizards? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It's really hard. There is no standardized one size fits all conservation strategy for helping lizards. These things need to be bespoke and tailored to your ecosystem and species. And even then, it's hard to know how well they're working. So I think more research in that space will be really important. But I think it's important to think about those animals at the very least. And so if you are doing lots of predator control, maybe consider doing some mouse control. Maybe consider putting some snap traps in the back of the trap to help with the mice, because if you're just setting your plates at 80 grams or something to target stoats, you're not going to be catching mice. And similarly, weasels are also a big problem that people forget about, but they're also huge lizard predators. And so if you're just focused on those heavier mustelids, you're not going to be trapping weasels. So thinking more about them.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because they often are under the radar as well, especially because they don't tend to show up in traps because they're too light, and particularly female weasels, which, guess how the populations will increase? It's by them giving birth to more offspring. So it's so interesting how it's all connected, and how it's so important to think bigger picture and to actually pay attention to the entire ecosystem and every single species within. But to zoom back in on the work and the mahi you do at Southern Lakes Sanctuary, what are your next steps for the Alpine Wētā in your area?
Yeah, so basically this field season, we're going to try again. We'll head into the field for about 5 days, and we'll just try to do what we were unsuccessful at doing last field season. So I'll head into the field with a good field team, and we're going to look for Wētā. We're going to deploy a bunch of tracking tunnels, might deploy some cameras, and we're just going to compare several different monitoring strategies. So distance sampling, mark-recapture, and hopefully that'll give us all the information that we need to guide this project moving forward, and then we can start think about experimentally managing them. So there's a spot nearby which we recently found Wētā living in, and we didn't see many there. The discovery of them was rather fortuitous, like we just happened to be in there because we were a little more slow going than we anticipated getting to our original site. So I was like, oh, I'll go look in here for Wētā, looks like nice habitat. Sure enough, found them, but there weren't too many. And that same night we saw 2 stoats. So hopefully we're going to try to focus our efforts on that site. And once we've got like a nice monitoring strategy that we're confident will give us a good understanding of the Wētā population, we'll start to play around with management strategies in terms of removing predators.
How do you find them in the first place? Is it just you walk and you spot them, or I envision you on your knees turning around essentially everything that's on the ground to try and know if they're there or not?
So searching at night is definitely the most efficacious strategy for finding Wētā, at least the species, and I would argue most species. Initially, I found them in this area because I was simultaneously looking for lizards, and I was also hoping I'd find Wētā, and I turned a rock and there were 3 giant Wētā under the house. Yes, so cool. But I'm astonished at their ability to hide in small places. So there's places where you walk and it's kind of like just kind of tussock and quite fine-grained rock, and like to me it wouldn't look like there were many places for a hefty insect to hide. But then you go at night and the place is just alive with Wētā. So you really, to understand what numbers Wētā in, at least just visually, just to get a feel for it, really need to be walking around at night spotlighting for them.
That is so cool. I think if you're passionate about this, that's kind of what ticks the box why we do this, Mahi, all right? But I just want to go full circle, zooming out a bit again. And we said creepy crawlies before at the beginning of our podcast. So public perception of invertebrates isn't always the best. So how can we create a better understanding and an appreciation for these such crucial species in our ecosystems?
Yeah, I'm always pained by people's perceptions of critters, but I'm also like grateful for the opportunity to try to help people change their minds. And that's something that I take as like a personal challenge. I think it's just about telling stories and finding ways to connect them to people. I think that's probably most important, because, you know, you can show someone a 6-legged creature that scuttles around at nighttime and just be in total adoration and expect them to share that. For some people, they're just like, no, thank you. That thing's got like antennae. No thanks. But if you can find a way that they can connect with it, and normally that's through storytelling. Normally that's through telling stories about people. So for example, recently someone named Annie Yeoman published this book about native lizards. And instead of just being a traditional, this is Mokopiriraco galaxius, this is a forest gecko, they live in trees, she told all these different stories about conservationists and scientists and people in the community working with native lizards. And that meant that this book could touch so many people's hearts who may not necessarily otherwise be interested in reading or learning about lizards. And so I think telling those stories about insects is most important. There's people like me who, you know, I get super excited if you tell me that a tiny little crab-roned wasp will paralyze a cockroach and drag it into a burrow and lay its eggs in there. But for some people, that's actually abhorrent and they don't want to know that. Or they certainly want it to be delivered to them in a way that's like slightly more comforting or something. So really introducing the people element for some of these animals, I think, is important, and telling stories.
Yeah. And one thing that I do is wearing this jumper.
If you're listening to the audio version, and is wearing a Tumbleweeds t-shirt. Tumbleweeds is a great brand, by the way. We're not paid to say that, promise. And it's covered in Wētā, and it's awesome.
When I first bought this jumper, I never thought about the potential of it being a conversation starter, but I get so many comments being like, what's that on your jumper? And I go, what? Glad you asked. I actually really enjoy wearing that jumper and having those conversations with people. It's been a real eye-opener to me what clothing can do as well.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I mean, I can't say I see too many people wearing T-shirts with insects on them ever. And when I do, I normally go straight up to them and I'm like, hey, can you tell me more about this?
Can we be friends?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's awesome. And I definitely do the same. And would definitely encourage more people to like make good quality. Like there's not like Tumbleweed are one of the only people that make like really high quality critter merch. So any clothing brands out there, you want to make some cool critter merch, please.
Absolutely. And I think just wrapping up that point, like it's easy when you get into the weeds of conservation to think about species and methodology and controls. And to us, this is fascinating. But to the general public, I don't think it's as interesting as we find it. But telling stories in culture and art and clothing and fashion, and, this is a playing field that everyone can find interest in. And I think it's actually underestimated how powerful things like a T-shirt can be to tell a story.
Can I just rewind a little bit? I just want to mention something because it's quite topical. We're talking about people and what they can do to help ecosystems and what they need to think about when doing so for critters. One very important thing that people should be aware of is the totality of species in their ecosystem. So before you go into an ecosystem, whether it's indigenous or whether it's an exotic ecosystem, whether it's covered in weeds or whether it's native forest, I think it's really important to try to develop some kind of understanding of what lives there before you start changing it too much. The reason I'm bringing this up now is because several times lately, I've seen multiple instances of people going and clearing all this native vegetation or a whole bunch of weeds, and they just probably have no idea, but that's actually really important habitat for a lot of native wildlife now. And I've seen it from like institutions, like big organizations and branches of the government, things like that. I've seen it from councils. I've seen it from small groups. And that ultimately just comes down to people's understanding of what lives there. A lot of people will look at a bush and just think, oh yeah, that's not home to anything. Let's make this pretty. But in doing so, they could potentially be killing or displacing wildlife. So just because last night I had a conversation about this happening recently, and I saw some images of a place which was like lush habitat teeming with amazing geckos, and then someone has subsequently cleared all that vegetation and they've planted natives there. And so they think they're probably doing a service, and that's awesome. And they've made it a bit more accessible to people and a bit more pretty, but in doing so, they've displaced native wildlife, and that's a real problem. So just thinking about what lives in those ecosystems and not presuming that critters don't live in those ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think in my mind, I'd love for people to do more monitoring before they start their mahi, understanding what's already there so we can protect that. And just case in point, isn't there some Wētā species up here with us in the North Island that was hiding in gorse?
Yeah. So that was the Mahui Nui giant Wētā, which pretty much their last stronghold was a patch of gorse near Te Kuiti. And it's thought that gorse helped protected them from predators, less favourable for mice and things like that. And that's pretty much, there's like an adjacent forest habitat originally, but that's basically where they survive. I think the chances of that happening again elsewhere are slim, but don't presume. Often native reptiles, beautiful green geckos and woodworthy geckos and skinks and rare insects, they will often live in patches of weeds and patches of vines and tiny little pockets of rocky habitat.
Yeah, so I think as tempting as it can be to get stuff done, to clear that bush or clear those weeds or remove those predators, it's really important that we have an understanding first. We've talked a lot about Wētā, but you also work with lizards, right? So would you like to give us an overview of what Southern Lake Sanctuary is doing with lizards?
So to date, most of the work I've done with lizards through Southern Lakes is survey work. You can't really protect species if you don't know that they're there. And so I've done a lot of surveys, just searching areas to find lizards and following up on records. That's primarily the work I've done with lizards thus far. We're hoping to do more in that space. We're hoping to do some more research. We're hoping to try to do trial some predator control strategies at a small scale. And we've also done a bit of research looking at monitoring methods. Recently, we were involved in a paper that was published which looked at using eDNA, so environmental DNA, as a way of monitoring the occupancy of skink populations.
That is amazing. And eDNA, I'm presuming, gives you a picture of your species diversity in a place, or how does that work?
Yeah, so basically in this particular project, we'd put out little pipes, and it'd have like a small filter inside that would kind of naturally collect bits of DNA that were in the environment. So, you know, I think there was like someone's lunch in there at some point, because obviously they might have like touched their finger and touched the pipe. But it's generally not like super prone to contamination and things like that. But yeah, basically put in a pipe, and in theory, if there's animals there and they'll walk through the pipe, they'll leave tiny bits of their DNA. So skinks particularly, they quite regularly slough their skin, they shed scales, and even just by walking through the pipe, they'll probably shed tiny little particulates of DNA in there. And so then you can go and take the filter, stick it in a tube, send that away to a lab. In this case, it was Wētā lab that we worked with on this project. And then they can run DNA assays and basically figure out what all is in that sample using like mass primers and things like that.
Why do animals walk through pipes? Like, do they say, oh, there's something new, I'm going to go check it out? Or do you get all the lizards in a area if you put a pipe down? Or do you need to put some like lizard mating call in the pipe? Like, how does that work?
This is like several-fold answer to this question. Basically, you need some kind of like device so that you can roll things out in a standardized way. That's helpful for science, but that's also just helpful in terms of implementation. But it also means that it's like you're kind of containing the area of DNA collection. And so it makes it less prone to contamination and things like that. Skinks are inquisitive. They explore a lot. And if you put something in their habitat, they probably will end up on it. Like you put tracking tunnels out, quite often skinks will hide underneath the tracking tunnels. And sometimes they'll climb up on top of the tracking tunnels and bask. They just use these things like they're part of their terrain. But we initially tested this, and sweet, it works. You can get skinks going in tunnels. And I suggested that actually we bait the tunnels. We know it works in principle. We know that in an unbiased fashion, without like, you know, changing the chemistry of the device, it works. But I reckon we'll be able to maximize skink captures if we put pear in there, because we know canned pear increases the number of lizards entering pitfall traps and things. So let's put pear in there. It should result in more skinks. And sure enough, you put some smelly pear in there, skink goes, oh, mate, that smells like some good sugary sweetness. I'm going to go after that. And you get more skinks walking into the pipes.
Good old bribery, eh? Doesn't only work on humans. So you already mentioned before that mice will attack skink and lizards. What about any other threats that they face? Is it similar to our inverts, or what's going on the lizard front there?
Yeah, I think so. So a lot of what I've discussed with invertebrates definitely applies to lizards in terms of predators, climate change as well, and habitat modification. And habitat modification is actually quite a big one for lizards. Quite often lizards will persist in tiny little pockets of habitat. If you clear habitat completely, it's just not suitable for most of our lizards. They just won't survive. They need complex habitats just for themselves to like find food and seek refuge and have like varying microclimates, so that if they're a bit too hot, they can move into a slightly cooler area and vice versa. But also it means that with the advent of mammalian predators, having complex habitats helps them evade predators too. Protecting lizard habitats is really important. If you convert a whole bunch of lizard habitat to a homogeneous pasture of really short grass, probably not going to be very lizard friendly. If you've got a full-on rabbit warren going on, there probably won't be really many lizards living there, certainly not throughout most of the area. Similarly, if you go cut down a whole bunch of trees in a native forest, there'll still be geckos way up those trees. It's not going to be great. So habitat modification, real big one. And also an added element to that is fire. And that's becoming seemingly increasingly a problem in New Zealand, where people are burning off habitat or people are being irresponsible with fire, and it's literally resulting in the deaths of thousands and thousands of lizards, and it's heartbreaking.
I guess that's the stop and think, right? Before you do anything, and think about our smaller critters. But also, in particular here on the North Island, I think we have this little critter called the rainbow skink, which is an introduced species. And there's talk going on that they can potentially displace our natives or endemics. Is that actually true? Is that a real worry, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for referring to it as the rainbow skink rather than the plague skink. I don't like propaganda for these sorts of things, because it is just a little animal that ended up in New Zealand because of people. So it's not really fair to the animal to rebrand it as a plague skink, even if it is possibly posing an environmental risk. So there's been some research done in the behavioural space by some good folk up in Auckland and Northland, and they basically looked at what happened in an ecosystem where you've got Aotearoa skinks, which are a very rare, critically threatened skink living up at Breamhead, and rainbow skinks, and what happens when these skinks sort of meet one another. And their study basically demonstrated that, if you have like a nice little basking spot and you've got a Aotearoa skink hanging out and then an exotic rainbow skink comes along, quite often the Aotearoa skink will behave aggressively, or it might run away or something like that. And so it's a type of like interference competition. Obviously, that time that a Aotearoa skink spends behaving aggressively or running away or posturing up, whatever it's doing, that's going to take away from time it could just spend catching rays or finding insects. And they obviously overlap heavily in habitat use. So there's definitely elements of their ecology that means that they could be impacting our native lizards. It's possible that they could be vectors of disease. But to date, the evidence that would suggest that they're like this major pest for native lizards is very, very limited. And so I would caution anyone that refers to these things as plague skinks, but in doing so responds accordingly by euthanizing these animals. I would strongly advise against that, because people just misidentify lizards. I know of many instances where people have killed native lizards because they simply have not been able to correctly identify them, and under the name of conservation and killing plague skinks, they've just killed native lizards. Is there a potential for them to impact our native wildlife? Yes, but are they deserving of like non-systematic killing and, potentially with the risk of killing native wildlife? I do not think so. If you've got like a really special place that does not have rainbow skinks and they have not arrived there yet, then, understandably you might want to keep them out of that area. But in places like Auckland, these things are ubiquitous. Unless there's some kind of like major systematic program going on, they're never going to be removed. So I don't think there's any merit in going after these things and persecuting them.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to zoom back into your mahi at Southern Lakes Sanctuary. What are your next steps to better understand, monitor, and hopefully better protect lizards in your area?
We need to do some more survey work. There's certain species in our area which we would like to understand more. One of those is the Takitimu gecko. To date, I've been unsuccessful at finding any more localities for the species. They have been recorded in our project area. I've revisited the location where they were found. I've not been able to find them. However, it is a vast, complex landscape, and it was just me searching. So this field season, I'll assemble a bit of a team and we'll have another stab and see if we can try and find some of them. And then we can start thinking about how we might be able to help them. Again, that'll be very complex, but at least if we know where they are, we can have these discussions, because at the moment we don't have that information. And I think that's just like really helpful. So another thing that we're going to be doing is trialing in a fairly robust way. We're gonna do some small scale predator control in like local parks and areas where a lot of the community do trapping, and we're going to monitor lizard populations, and we're going to try to deduce what kind of an impact that has on the lizard population. So shortly, we're going to do some pre-monitoring. So we're basically going to go and count what's there, index what's there, and then we'll implement some more intensified predator control, and then we'll see what happens. And I think that's something that is really important for conservationists, is doing that pre-monitoring. It's really helpful for storytelling, but it's also critical for understanding the impact you're having. And unfortunately, the current framework for funding and funding acquisition, it's quite challenging, because people often just want to fund something there, and then there's often not much wiggle room for the groundwork. And also sometimes you just want to get stuck into things. You don't want to faff around putting up monitoring devices. Let's just get stuck into it. But if you do have some level of pre-monitoring, that will really help your understanding of your outcomes. So we're going to try to do a bit of that shortly with some of our local lizards. And also there's some amazing habitat restoration projects in the district, particularly Whakatipu Reforestation Trust. They do so much native planting in the district. And so I've been fortunate enough to have some conversations with them recently, and hopefully we're going to do some slightly more lizard-oriented plantings in certain areas, because obviously it's awesome if you go and plant a native forest, that's amazing. But if one of the only native species surviving in that area is a terrestrial skink that loves the sun, and you plant out its habitat into forest, obviously that's not actually ideal for the local population of lizards. So just thinking about how we can manage these sorts of things moving forward should be fun.
Nah, that's awesome. And again, we're back at understanding the bigger picture, right? And I think once you start, you can never go back to do your pre-monitoring. So just really urging to people to listen and act. But for members of the public who use your area, which is a huge area that you guys cover, for example, through hiking, is there any way for them to get involved and help protect either the Alpine Wētā or the lizard populations, or just invertebrates in general?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing which you can really help me with is if you see a lizard, take a photo of it and record where you saw it. Yeah, so Doc actually has you can make submissions on the Doc website through filling out an observation card, and that's helpful for so many reasons. It's just helpful because it adds to Doc's general lizard database, but it also has, it influences, land development and thing moving forward. So if you find lizards in a place that's about to be developed, then potentially there will be extra consideration put into that place on how we need to manage those lizards. If that knowledge isn't there, potentially depending on where you live in New Zealand, developers can just go and, crunch up a bunch of lizard habitat. So we want to be working with people that are developing land and people that are working on farms. And I think often there's a hesitancy to share knowledge because of these sorts of processes. And I can understand that. But most of the time, us lizard folk, we just want to help the local lizards. And most of the time, we're not even going to interfere with any practices that are happening. We just want to do things to help them. So yeah, recording where lizards are. And also, so for some of the stuff we're planning next, having sites where I know lizards live, or I know where certain species live, and I know what the habitat's like, that's so helpful. Because if I can just click on my computer and say, oh yeah, there's lizards here, they'll still be there, the habitat's there, all good. That's great. I can start planning things. But if I'm oh, there haven't been lizards recorded there probably are. But then it means I kind of have to go and do a trip down there, and then it just makes work a lot harder. Whereas some of my colleagues and other people, they've been finding lizards locally recently, and it's awesome. It means that we have more options for when we're trying to design, whether it's predator control or monitoring. I can just be oh, there's that place that Daniel found geckos at. Why don't we consider that place? And it's really helpful. Now, that's also very true for remote ecosystems. Some of our most threatened species and rare species have just been discovered by people going for a jaunt in the hills or maybe climbing a mountain, and they'll see an interesting animal, oh, that looks funny. And it turns out they've discovered a new species or a new population of a threatened species. So taking photos of lizards just to help us confirm the identification of them and recording where you find them, that goes a long way. But then also if people want to get involved, we've got lots of trap lines running with some of our partner groups like Whakatepa Wildlife Trust, and there's always ways people can help with trapping, even if it is, primarily bird oriented. There's lots of amazing work being done in this district.
That's fantastic. It's some really good practical stuff that you can do to get involved. Hey, Sam, a question we ask every guest, and I'm really curious to know your answer, is what does conservation mean to you?
I think it's trying our best to protect the totality of wildlife that we live with. It's not about protecting one given species or one given area. It's about trying to understand the totality of wildlife in those ecosystems and doing our best to protect it. And I think, for me at least, it's critical that you do so in obviously a practicable manner, but also I think introducing science is really important into it, because if you're not understanding it on quite a high level some of the time, it means you might not necessarily be helping. And I think that sometimes that does happen, is people presume that what they're doing is helping, but if they're not outcome measuring or they're not being robust with how they design their predator control or their management strategy, they won't necessarily know if it is working. So just trying to protect the totality of wildlife and doing so in a smart and practicable way.
I think that's critical, to be honest. So thank you for sharing that. It's been a really fascinating chat, just pulling back the surface and the gloss of big fancy birds and trees, and looking at the ecosystems and the invertebrates and the life that we often gloss over. So thank you so much for all this knowledge you're sharing that is often not considered.
Yeah, kia ora, Sam. Thank you so much. And for those people who haven't listened to Paul's episode, where can people head online to get involved?
So people can visit our website. They can get in touch with some of our partner groups. So Aotearoa Wildlife Trust, Forest and Bird, River Dart Wildlife Trust. Lots of amazing groups in the district that we work quite closely with.
Amazing. If you're keen to get involved, the link will be down in the show notes. So head to the website to find out more. And yeah, as Callum already said, thank you so much, Sam, for pulling back the curtain and chat about the little amazing critters we have in our ecosystems with us today. Kia ora.
Yeah, thank you.
Kia ora.